Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing our 2022 October Senate prediction ahead of this fall's midterm election. So we're going to be taking a look at all of the competitive Senate races for this prediction video. All of the states that are already filled out are safe states that either party will win by 12 points or more. So there's really no reason to go into those states. Of course, I'll be predicting every single state in my final November prediction for the Senate races. So stay tuned for that. But of course, today we're going to focus on the competitive races. So of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. Now, I also have an announcement to make as well. I'm going to be live streaming the Pennsylvania Senate debate tomorrow at 7:30 Eastern. So if you're interested, set a reminder. The link is down below. So anyway, without further ado, let's get straight into these races. We're going to start off with the state of Washington and make our way east across the country. Patty Murray, the incumbent Democrat in this race, is running for a sixth term in the United States Senate against veteran advocate Republican challenger Tiffany Smiley. Now, if we take a look at the polling for this race so far, Murray is polling a lot lower than many would expect for a Democratic incumbent in a safe Democratic state like Washington. Currently, she's only up by 8.7 in the RCP average. Of course, when you average that with the 538 aggregate, you get a 9.1 advantage for Patty Murray. And of course, in 2020, Washington was the state that voted for Joe Biden by 19.2%. So this is by no means a competitive state on the national level. But of course, in a red wave midterm election with a strong Republican challenger like Tiffany Smiley, you see a candidate that is able to close the gap to a certain extent. Now, obviously, Patty Murray is the massive favorite to win this race. I think she will likely win this race by about 7 to 9 percentage points. So that's going to be a likely margin in the state of Washington. Tiffany Smiley is a very strong candidate, but Washington is an extremely blue state. I think if you put Tiffany Smiley in a state like Nevada or Pennsylvania, you know, she would probably win by a pretty decent margin. But of course, she's running in a safe blue state. She'll probably do as best as a Republican can in a state like Washington, but she's going to come up short by about 7 to 9 points. Moving on down to the state of Nevada, Adam Laxalt is a pretty strong Republican candidate. He had the benefit of not really running in a very contentious Republican primary, unlike Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania. So he started off with a pretty strong lead off the bat. Essentially, everyone knew he was going to be the nominee. He was polling 21% at the end of the day over his nearest challenger, Sam Brown. And of course, we take a look at the polling for this race. Laxalt leads in every single average, including 538, which tends to skew very Democratic. Currently, all of the latest polling has Adam Laxalt beating his Democratic opponent, Catherine Cortez Masto, by a couple of points. Of course, the average overall has him up by 1.2. Now, Nevada is a very interesting state because in the 2020 election, it actually slightly oversampled Democratic support. Of course, the RCP average was a lot closer than other averages, but Nevada historically has oversampled Republican support. So it will be interesting to see which way Nevada ends up skewing. Now, I ultimately think these polls slightly underestimate Adam Laxalt's strength in the state of Nevada, mainly because Nevada is a state that is shifting to the right. Again, Nevada was the only swing state that Hillary Clinton won back in 2016 that actually shifted to the right. And I always drive that point home because I think it's very significant, because all of the other swing states, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, every other swing state, Arizona, Georgia, all swung to the left. Nevada actually swung slightly to the right. So I think you're definitely going to see a shift in favor of the Republicans, specifically in Clark County, but you could potentially also see a Republican win in Washoe County as well. And of course, for a Republican to win statewide, they have to win Washoe County and they have to narrow up Clark County. And the fact that Donald Trump only lost Clark County by less than 9 percentage points is pretty impressive, considering that McCain lost Clark County by like 15 or 16 points. So overall, I think Laxalt probably wins this race. I think he probably wins by about 2 points or so. I actually think Joe Lombardo will do slightly better than Laxalt, just because I think Steve Sisolak is a slightly weaker incumbent. Moving on down to the state of Arizona. Now, Arizona is interesting because while Kari Lake is pulling ahead in the governor's race, Blake Masters is still behind in the Senate race. And now, if any of these Senate races of the toss-up races was going to go the most Democratic, I think it would be the state of Arizona. Now, I've previously given this as tilt Republican for Blake Masters, mainly because of the national environment and the fact that I think even though Kelly is polling ahead, polls in Arizona have notoriously overestimated Kelly's support in 2020. Of course, they overestimated Sinema's support in 2018 as well. So I really think that at the end of the day, if Kelly is only up by 2.5 in the RCP average, I think he's probably going to lose by a point, and I still stand by that. I think Blake Masters, at the end of the day, will probably win this race by a point, maybe a point and a half. So I think this will be a tilt Republican win. Moving on over to Colorado. Now, Colorado has a very interesting Republican nominee in Joe O'Dea, who has stirred up a lot of controversy among the Republican base for distancing himself from former President Donald Trump. Of course, if we take a look at the polling for this race, Bennett is currently up by about 7 points. And the interesting thing about Michael Bennett as a candidate is he is known to underperform his polls. Of course, if we go back to 2016, a lot of election analysts had this as either likely or safe Democratic. And at the end of the day, Michael Bennett only won this race by about 5 percentage points. All of the polls had him winning by 7, winning by 6, winning by 10, winning by 11. He was up by a much wider margin in most of these polls, and at the end of the day, he underperformed them by a couple of points, even with someone like Donald Trump on the ballot that only got 43% of the vote out of the state of Colorado. So I think Joe O'Dea is a pretty strong candidate. He does have problems, though, with alienating certain segments of the base by going so hard against Donald Trump, saying he would actively campaign against Trump in 2024 in the Republican primary. That doesn't really help him when he tries to, of course, win over these Republican voters that need to turn out in record numbers in the rural areas. But he's also trying to do a balancing act with independents in the suburbs, because Colorado is a deeply Democratic state now. This is a state that Joe Biden won by 13.5%, and incumbent Republican Senator Cory Gardner lost by 9.3%. So this is an extremely hard state for Republicans to win now. Some argue this is really Democrats' ceiling in the state of Colorado, but it's a state that's been moving pretty massively towards the Democrats, and I don't think that's going to change in 2022. While I do think Joe O'Dea is going to have a stronger performance, I can't see him winning this race. It would really be a shocking upset. If Cory Gardner was barely able to win in 2014, Joe O'Dea really doesn't have a shot. I could see him getting this race within 5 to 6 points, but that's about it. So I put that as lean, borderline likely for Michael Bennett in Colorado. Moving on over to the state of Wisconsin. This is a state that I actually think is a really good one for the Republican Party, because Ron Johnson has proven to be a pretty strong incumbent. Currently, he's up by about 2.7 in the RCP average. Polls in Wisconsin have notoriously underestimated Ron Johnson. Of course, back in 2016, Ron Johnson didn't lead in really a single poll up until around Election Day. He was down for literally years. Every poll that they conducted from 2013 to October of 2016, he was down, and he was down by a lot. And the fact that the polls now seem to be having Johnson as the favorite only indicates to me that I think he's going to have a pretty good performance on election night. Ultimately, though, I think he probably wins this by about 5 points or so. I would hesitate to put it at 6, but I think Johnson probably wins by 5. Michaels wins by 3 in the state of Wisconsin. Moving on over to Ohio. Republicans really should be winning Ohio by a safe margin given the national environment. I mean, Republicans are expected to win the generic ballot by 2 to 3 points, possibly even 4 or 5, although I think it's more in the 2 to 3% range. If we take a look at Ohio overall, this was a state that barely shifted to the left from 2016 to 2020. Donald Trump still won the state of Ohio by 8.1%. And we had a lot of counties, most counties in Ohio, continue to shift more Republican, even as we had shifts away from the Republican Party in Franklin County, Montgomery County, the Cincinnati area, in Hamilton County. So really, this is a state that seems to be stagnating in sort of the likely Republican range. Now, Tim Ryan is a pretty good candidate optic-wise. He's very much Mr. Middle Class, Mr. Ohio. Pretty strong candidate, definitely the best candidate that the Democrats could have run. Vance seems to be a very lazy campaigner. He's not exactly viewed favorably by the wider Ohio electorate, while Tim Ryan is. So while I think Vance is going to win this race, he's going to overperform Donald Trump. Now, if the polling error in Ohio was the same as it was in 2020, Vance would win by nearly 10 percentage points. But I think Tim Ryan is going to do a lot better than people expect as of right now. I think this is probably going to be an R+5, maybe R+6 margin. I'll put it in the likely column. I think Vance will probably win by about 6 points, but it's still going to be underperforming Donald Trump's margin of victory in 2020. And again, it really didn't have to happen, but I think all of the Republican candidates that were put up, maybe minus Matt Dolan, were very weak candidates overall in the general election. Of course, Matt Dolan had his own issues with the Republican base, so none of the Republican Senate candidates in Ohio were particularly strong in the primary. Moving on over to the Granite State, Don Bolduc is currently going up against Maggie Hassan, the incumbent Democratic senator who, in her last election, only won by 0.2% against incumbent Kelly Ayotte. Currently, Hassan is up by about 5 points or so. The race has been narrowing. I think this is mainly due to the fact that Republicans overall. One of the reasons why I think the Republican surge is real is the fact that we're not only seeing it in the generic ballot, but we're seeing it in basically every single swing state. Republicans are doing better than they were even just a couple of weeks ago. And, you know, we were talking about the post-Labor Day shift in favor of the Republicans. It took a few weeks longer than many anticipated, but ultimately it is here. And while I think Republicans are going to do well in a lot of states, I think they're going to fall short in the state of New Hampshire. I think Maggie Hassan probably will win this race by about 2 to 3 points. I think Bolduc will get closer. Obviously, I think he's going to overperform Trump 2020, but I don't think it's going to be enough to win at this point. Moving on down to Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania is probably the most important Senate race in the entire country, because I think it's really going to serve as the bellwether to which party controls the Senate. Because if John Fetterman wins the Senate race in Pennsylvania, it's very likely that Kelly holds on in Arizona, Georgia, Warnock holds on. So really it is that key indicator, and it's why I've always stressed that Pennsylvania is the most important state in the entire country for the 2022 midterm elections. Now, of course, John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor, is being challenged by Republican Dr. Mehmet Oz. Now, if we take a look at the polls for this race, they have tightened quite dramatically since polling started for this race. Of course, early on, Dr. Oz was really doing very poorly. He was in a really contentious primary against several other Republicans. He had a few gaffes throughout the summer that really kind of hurt him among independents and even some Republicans. But then around August, September, you really start to see Oz do significantly better in the polls. To now, Fetterman is only up by 2.4% in the RCP average. Now, the RCP average was almost spot on back in the 2020 election. I think it had Pennsylvania as Biden plus 1.3. Biden won Pennsylvania by 1.2. Now, ultimately, if that's the case for this election, that would mean Fetterman would win this race, but I think the polls are expected to tighten even more as we get closer. I expect Dr. Oz to probably lead in another poll or so before Election Day. And ultimately, I think he's going to pull through in this race because, as we've noticed, there's a lot of split ticket voting happening in the Philadelphia suburbs, which is probably the most crucial area in the entire state of Pennsylvania, because back in 2016, Pat Toomey beat his Democratic challenger, Katie McGinty, not because he did particularly well in the rural areas. He underperformed in nearly all of them, but he did much better in the Philadelphia collar counties, in Montgomery, Bucks, Chester, and Delaware County. These are the areas that I think are Dr. Oz's strengths, and I think this is an area where you're going to see a lot of Shapiro-Oz voters. You'll probably see that all across the state of Pennsylvania, but I think it's going to be strongest in the Philadelphia collar counties. Of course, you also have Western Pennsylvania, which Dr. Oz needs to do very well if he's going to win. Of course, for John Fetterman, the path to victory is easier because Pennsylvania is still more of a Democratic-leaning state. All he really has to do is hold Biden's margins in Philadelphia and the collar counties. It doesn't look like he's going to do that, but he's really banking on rural support. He's banking on chipping away at Dr. Oz's and Republicans' margins in the suburbs. And really, he's counting on Josh Shapiro's coattails to win this race. And ultimately, I don't think it's going to happen because I think Shapiro is probably going to win by 3 to 5 points. I don't know if that's going to be enough to carry John Fetterman over the top. And, you know, early on, John Fetterman was seen as a favorite for this race, but I think his health issues, coupled with the fact that Republicans have now invested very heavily in the state of Pennsylvania and hammered John Fetterman on his position of crime, I think it's really damaged his image with the people of Pennsylvania, who maybe prior to that thought he was a very moderate working class sort of candidate. Now he's been sort of branded as this far left extremist on issues like crime and drugs. So ultimately, it will be interesting to see what the results are in Pennsylvania for governor and Senate and what the margins will be. I personally still think that Dr. Oz will win this race in Pennsylvania. I think independents will break for him. In Pennsylvania, independents have been breaking for Dr. Oz in the polling that we've seen, both Democratic and Republican leaning. It's really just been an issue of sampling. A lot of these polls are oversampling Democratic voters, or you have polls that have John Fetterman winning 15% of Republican voters, which isn't going to happen. I mean, Joe Manchin didn't even win 16% of Republican voters when he won back in 2018. So that really goes to show you how partisan the country has really become. So ultimately, I think Dr. Oz pulls away with this race. I think the margin of victory will be anywhere from 0.5 to 1.5%. I think the debate performance really is important for both candidates. I think if John Fetterman somehow does well in the debate tomorrow night, which, by the way, link to the live stream down below, 7:30 p.m. Eastern time. Join us. We'll be live streaming the debate. But if John Fetterman does well in that debate, I think There is a possibility that he could still win this race for Senate, but I think if Dr. Oz does really well and John Fetterman does poorly, I think that's really the nail in the coffin for the Fetterman campaign. So I'm giving this race to Oz because of the national environment, but a Fetterman victory is still possible, although I think it's not the most likely scenario at this point in time. Moving on down to North Carolina, this is a state where polls tend to overestimate Democratic support. Cheri Beasley is a former state Supreme Court justice who lost re-election in 2020, going up against Congressman Ted Budd. Budd has been up in the polls by about 2.5% according to the RCP average. He's leading in every single poll that we have out of the month of October. Polls tend to underestimate Republican support by 2 to 3 points in North Carolina, sometimes 4. I still stand by Ted Budd winning this race by about 6 points. I think he's going to do significantly well in the suburbs and probably overperform Donald Trump's margins in some of the rural counties as well. Moving on down to the state of Georgia. Now, this is a really tough Senate race to categorize because I think it really hinges on how strong Kemp's performance is. I think the tipping point for Georgia is Kemp +6. I think if Kemp wins by 6 points, that will bring Walker above the runoff threshold. I think if he wins by less than 5, I think Walker probably goes to a runoff or even just loses on election night. I think Kemp is going to do fairly well. I've said he's going to win by 5 to 6, so I do think Walker will narrowly avoid a runoff, which probably means he's going to be winning by about 1.5%, somewhere around there, getting about 50.2% of the vote probably in the Senate race. The state of Georgia has not really been known to be a split ticket state, unless your name, of course, is Johnny Isakson, in which case a lot of people split their tickets to vote for him. Georgia, in particular, was the closest state in the 2020 election. Joe Biden only won it by 0.2%. He's extremely unpopular in the state of Georgia. Raphael Warnock, while he is a popular figure, is still a Democrat running in a very tough year for Democrats. I think he will do better than candidates like Catherine Cortez Masto, but I still think at the end of the day he's going to lose this race because I think there will be enough turnout among the Atlanta suburbs and rural Georgia to get Walker over the finish line. Because again, there is going to be split ticket voting in the Atlanta suburbs, but I don't think it's going to be enough to make that much of a massive difference. I would have a really hard time believing that Raphael Warnock will win outright on election night if Kemp is winning the governor's race by 5 to 6. You really don't see that sort of split ticket voting. Now, there is an argument to be made that there is a significant number of black males who are voting for Kemp, obviously relative to political history, that will vote for Warnock, but at the end of the day, I still think that's going to be a really small percentage of the electorate. I mean, David Perdue got 49.7% of the vote in Georgia. Donald Trump got 49.2%. Ossoff was the one who probably underperformed the most, getting about 48%. But these really aren't very big differences at the end of the day. This was the split ticketing that happened in 2020. It really was only a couple of points. So realistically, if you take this example, if Kemp is winning by 5 to 6, Walker is winning by 2 to 3, maybe even 3.5 points. But Walker himself is not a strong candidate, and that's one of the reasons why I put this as tilt Republican. I think he wins by about 1.5. Again, he's not the strongest candidate. He has a lot of issues, but I think the wave year and Brian Kemp being a popular governor will carry him over the top at the end of the day. Finally, we go down to the state of Florida. I've previously had Florida as safe Republican, but it looks like Marco Rubio actually might underperform Ron DeSantis, which is something I didn't really expect at the beginning of this. A lot of election predictors have put this as likely or lean Republican. He's only up by 2.8 in the polling average. Take that, of course, and compare it to Ron DeSantis's margin in the polling average, which is in RCP is plus 10, which is really mind-boggling. If that's the case, Ron DeSantis is on track for possibly a historic re-election in the state of Florida, but Marco Rubio looks like he's actually going to underperform this year, and there's probably a number of reasons for that. I think his problems with the Republican base is part of it. I also think DeSantis has wider crossover appeal than somebody like Marco Rubio, who previously back in 2016 I would have argued had much more crossover appeal than somebody like Ron DeSantis, but it's very clear that DeSantis has built a very successful brand in the state of Florida. He's a very popular incumbent governor, and he's on track to probably win a historic re-election margin. I'll probably have to change my Florida prediction in November if these polls continue, because it looks like DeSantis could end up winning by even 10 or 11 points when it's all said and done. Marco Rubio looks like he's going to run behind DeSantis. I think he probably wins by about 8 points, which is an overperformance of the polls. I think you do have some polls in this average that are sort of skewing it in favor of Val Demings. You have some polls that I think are certainly overestimating her, but it can't really be denied that DeSantis is outrunning Marco Rubio at this point, which is not something that I would have expected at the end of the day. So ultimately, this puts the Republicans at 53 Senate seats to Democrats 47. This is actually very similar to the map that RCP put out a few days ago, which is their official prediction. I stand by that. I've stood by 53-47 for quite a while now. I still think this is going to be the outcome. We'll see what happens in the next 2 weeks, and ultimately when I release my November prediction, that will be my final prediction for the 2022 midterm Senate races. And of course, this is our second to last video. It's hard to believe that the midterms are basically upon us. We've basically got 2 weeks until the midterm elections. Of course, tune in tomorrow night for our coverage of the Pennsylvania Senate debate, 7:30 Eastern, link down in the description. As always, again, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I hope to see you in the next one.